Hello and welcome to the first edition of Nuclear Waste Matters. We're going to be broadcasting today on KCCC in Carlsbad, New Mexico. But we're also, if you're watching this, we're on our YouTube channel and on Facebook. So thanks for joining us today. We're going to be talking about the consolidated interim storage facilities here in New Mexico, but there's also one in Texas, or a proposed one in Texas. And joining me direct from his home in the state of Washington, none other, he's very familiar to many of the people who work at WIP in Carlsbad, none other than Dr. Jim Conca. Jim, how are you?
Very good. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. Tell me a little bit, by way of introduction, tell us a little bit about yourself, your experience, and your time in Carlsbad, or in New Mexico also.
Well, I started out actually at NASA as a planetary scientist in 1985, having just graduated with a PhD from Caltech. And I was coordinator of shuttle activities over the poles. And the Challenger blew up. And so many of us youngins had to go find other jobs. And it's kind of interesting. Many of us from NASA went into the nuclear field. And it's kind of, you might say, gee, that's weird. But it actually, they're both outside the box thinking, required. And it fit really, really well. So I then went to Pacific Northwest Laboratory up here near the Hanford site in Richland, Washington, and started working on nuclear waste issues on Yucca Mountain specifically in 1985, when I was still a postdoc, and so that started the whole career with nuclear waste, which has been fascinating. Actually, it's kind of funny. So Yucca Mountain was the start of that, and then I did a little spin-off business. DOE wanted, they love to spin off technologies. My wife and I invented a couple of technologies, and it's interesting. Spinning off a small business, but if it's not Velcro, it ain't worth it. So, but it did teach me a lot about small business, which is very, very interesting because scientists generally do not have a clue how to do that. So that was neat. But in 1999, came down to Los Alamos, up on the hill, and helped, was one of the authors of the original license application to DOE for Yucca, from DOE to NRC for the Yucca Mountain project. So very proud of that work. It's a lousy site, but very proud of that work. And then came down to WIP in 2000 and helped open the Los Alamos group there, the Los Alamos group in office in Carlsbad. And then a few years doing that, I became director of the Carlsbad Environmental Monitoring Research Center, run by NMSU. So I was director of that for 6 years, and then came back to up to Hanford in 2011, and then kind of retired a few years later. Well, I was director of another rad lab up here for a while, and then kind of retired in 2014.
So you're very familiar with Carlsbad and the region down there from your WIP days, correct?
Absolutely, it's a brilliant place.
Oh yeah, and right now this time of year the weather's beautiful down there. Let me ask you this: what is spent fuel, and how is it currently stored? And I've seen the videos that you've put together. I've seen them on YouTube, for instance. But what is spent fuel, and how is it currently stored?
Well, in order to have a controlled chain reaction in a nuclear reactor to produce heat that then produces steam that turns a turbine and produces electricity, just like a gas plant or anything else, or any thermal plant, you have to enrich uranium to a few percent, just 3 to 4% for most designs, and then you make a fuel pellet out of it, which is about the size of one of your knuckles, and then you put all of those into fuel rods and then to a fuel bundle, and you put that into a reactor. And the reactor, depending on the type and the size, has a couple of hundred fuel bundles in it. Then when you put it into the reactor and it runs for 6 years, producing heat, and then you take it out and you put it in a pool of water, because most of the fission products, well, how nuclear works is that you have uranium-235 and it splits into two unequal pieces and it puts out a bunch of neutrons. It splits more and more and more. And after 6 years, the splitting, the fissioning has built up so much junk that it starts scarfing up all the neutrons and the thing fizzles out. So it's not that it's spent or used up completely. You just have too much junk in it. Only about 5% of the energy is used. But you take it out and you put it in a pool of water, because some of those fission products, not all of them, but some of them are pretty hot, meaning they give off gamma radiation. But most of those die away within 5 years. I mean, completely gone. Okay, there's only two of significance left, cesium-137 and strontium-90. And those are, the half-life of those is 30 years. And a rule of thumb is 7 half-lives to background. So, 30 years times 7, 210 years. So that fuel is hot, sort of, for 200 years or so. Okay, and then those are gone. So all the gamma emitters are gone after 200 years. Okay, all the stuff that makes fuel hot. What's left are beta and alpha emitters, like uranium and plutonium, a little bit of plutonium. Now, you might say, oh my God, that's dangerous. So you could hold plutonium in your hand. I have. Okay, it's no big deal. Can't hurt you. The radiation can't even pass your dead skin cell layer. So, I mean, you have to powder it and ingest it. You have to breathe it in order to have it do anything to you.
Right.
And so then the fuel changes. So after 200 years or so, the fuel is now kind of like the ore that originated. Okay, so it's not very hot, it won't really hurt anyone, but you gotta deal with it until most of those decay away, and then you're just left with uranium and the really long stuff. Now, the half-life, the definition of a half-life, as you probably can guess from the name, is that it's the amount of time after which half of the stuff is gone. So that nucleus is just gone. It's converted into something else. And so the longer the half-life, the weaker the radiation, as you'd expect. So the shorter the half-life, the stronger the radiation, which means that it has a short half-life, which means it's just going great guns. It's just throwing out stuff and decaying away. So the short half-life stuff is hot and it's gone. So all you're left with after 200 years is the long stuff. Okay, and it's not very hot. So you kind of have two strategies, or two types of waste that you need to be aware of. It's not just all one thing. And when someone says, oh, it's dangerous for 1,000,000 years, that's not true. Okay, it's dangerous for about 200, 300 years. And then it's not so dangerous for the next 100,000 years or so before most of the other stuff is decayed away. Now, the half-life of uranium-235 is 700 million years, which is pretty long. And so, yeah, so this is what you're dealing with. So when you take the fuel out of the reactor, you put it into a pool of water for 4 or 5 years till all the really hot stuff is gone. Then you put it in dry cask storage, pretty much until you're going to permanently dispose of it, or you're going to leave it there in the dry cask for a while until the cesium and strontium decay away mostly. Then it's a lot cooler, a lot easier to handle. And then you can do whatever you want with it. Now, Bill Gates is designing a reactor that can burn that waste. And other people are talking, they're called fast reactors. So there's, it's not waste because 95% of the energy is still in the fuel. So either you throw it away completely, forever and ever, and then you find a good place to do that, a good rock that will isolate it for millions of years without any help, or you put it aside and decide what you're going to do with it later on.
So let me do a quick housekeeping here real quick. You are listening to Nuclear Waste Matters. I'm Gerges Scott, and we are talking with Dr. Jim Conca. So, Jim, you said it's stored in a dry cask. Explain to me what those casks are and how robust they are.
They're as robust as humanly possible to make. I mean, it's, generally, we don't build things that can last forever. We don't build things that can last, going 80 miles an hour into a bunker wall, which these do. We don't make things that can drop from a great height onto a spike and it just does nothing and falls over. Or, we don't build things that last in burning fires and jet fuel at 2,000 degrees for hours, but we do these. Okay, so we make these so that literally it is almost impossible for us to do anything that will hurt them. Now, we've flown planes into them and we've done all this stuff, and they're robust is kind of a funny word because it really is robust. And the other thing is that it's just sitting there dry. I mean, this waste is dry. Okay, a lot of people, you watch The Simpsons and you see this green goo come out of the reactor. There's no goo in nuclear. Okay, nuclear weapons, there's goo. Okay, yeah, I get that. So I've worked a lot with nuclear weapons waste up here, and it is kind of peanut buttery, gross stuff that you got to deal with. So, but there's no goo in commercial nuclear fuel. Okay, it is solid. It is
It's
metal.
all,
And
yeah, it's all, they're pellets basically. It's all dry.
Right, it's metal and ceramic and stuff that just doesn't leak. So
and
when
they
you
put it in, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. So you put in these dry casts. I mean, there really isn't anything to leak. But given that there's layers of steel. I mean, very high non-corrosive steel, high strength steel that we don't use for most things, that just will not corrode. We even laser ping the wells so that they won't corrode. And then there's layers of cement. So it's pretty, yeah, it's pretty indestructible. Now you might say, well, if you hit it with an atomic bomb or something, yeah, okay, but then you get ridiculous. And for anything that we can envision, these are indestructible, and that they're made that way, and they're not that expensive. So it's just an ideal place to put this waste while it's cooling off over the next 100 years or so.
And they're currently stored at the commercial nuclear power generation facilities right now, right?
Right.
Why is that? Well, why do we need interim storage? Why do we just leave them where they're at? Why should we take them from where they're at and put them in a secure location?
Good point. A couple of reasons. One, a lot of times the reactors themselves are gone, and so all you have at this site is waste, which is kind of funny. So you're just paying people to watch this waste in a place that no longer even has a nuclear reactor. For ones that have for the waste that's sitting at active reactor sites, that's fine for a while, but we have 121 or so of these sites, and people talk about risk. The risk is really low, of course, but still, the risk is based on the number of sites. It's not based on much else. It's based on the number of sites. So if you have one site versus 121 sites, then your risk is actually 100 times more. And it doesn't make any sense to do that. Also, there are some places where the waste is sitting next to a river or something like that. Now, again, I don't have any problem with that, but some people do. And they say, well, we don't want it next to any body of water. So, okay, let's put it in all of them in a single place that is absolutely optimum for storage, has no water around it, no aquifer beneath it that matters, and is in a place where it doesn't rain, it doesn't have earthquakes, it doesn't have volcanoes, it doesn't have folding or faulting or anything else. And that place we know many places like that, but there's one in particular that is fantastic, and it's why we picked that place for WIP.
Okay, so let's get a little specific, because you said earlier, by the way, you're listening to Nuclear Waste Matters here on KCCC Carlsbad, and I'm talking with Jim Conca. Jim, you said earlier that Yucca Mountain was a lousy site. First of all, why was that a lousy site, and why is the proposed location for the consolidated interim storage facility that Holtec and the Eddie Lee Energy Alliance have proposed for that site basically in between Carlsbad and Hobbs, in the middle of nowhere?
Good. So there's two parts to that question. One is just permanent disposal forever and ever, and the other is interim storage for 100 years or so. Okay, or until you figure out the forever.
Well,
and ever
the license
right.
that Holtec and Eddie Lee Energy Alliance are going for from the NRC is for 40 years right now. So anything
Right.
can happen between now and 40,
Right.
between then and 40 years.
And actually, I just want to digress a bit
Sure,
for that
absolutely.
40 years. The 40 years came out of the Atomic Energy Commission, okay, which is the predecessor to DOE and NRC. So the Atomic Energy Commission split into two parts, DOE and NRC. And prior to that, in the 50s, essentially, we hadn't done much. We built some weapons. We in 1957 the first commercial reactor came online at Shippingport, but we didn't know, we didn't have this for decades like we have now. And so the AEC said, arbitrarily picked right out of the air, what limit should we place on the first license? It's not a design life at all. Okay, the design life of the big nukes are about 80 years, not 40. Everyone thinks this 40-year licensing period is some kind of design life. No, it isn't. Okay, it was just an arbitrary number picked by AEC to say, okay, it's been running for 40 years. Let's take a really close look at it again and see what's going on. See if there's any cracks in the concrete, although they do that anyway. See, what the core is doing. I mean, again, take it a really good look as though you are licensing again for the first time. That's all that was. So 40 years is simply just an arbitrary time that is a good length of time, so you can figure out if it's working well, and is a good, is about the right time to look at it closely again. But it has nothing to do with the design life. All right, so backing up again in 1957, because we had some weapons waste, we were now creating commercial waste, which are completely different, of course. The AEC said, we have a bunch of this waste now, and we're going to make more. It's not much, but we're going to make more. What should we do with this? Now, the priority of World War II was to win World War II. Okay, so that they really weren't caring about the waste at that time. Okay, but now here it comes the 50s, and we become prosperous and relatively peaceful, and the AEC goes to the National Academy of Sciences and says, what should we do with this? And National Academy of Sciences did a really nice study, took about 3 years, but I swear the answer came up in about 30 minutes over lunch because it's obvious. Okay? To any geologist like me, the only place to put this is in massive salt. Okay, not domal salt or anything, although it's not bad, but you want massive salt because massive salt is so tight that it takes water 1 billion years to move an inch. Now that's where you want a billion-year performance period. You don't want to have to worry about anything you put into this stuff. Okay, so that was 1957. National Academy of Sciences came up with that. And also the thing about salt, as you probably know about WIP, is that at depth, at the half-mile depth, the overburden pressure creeps closed any openings. So the salt in the Salado Formation, which is where WIP is, cannot sustain a fracture or an opening or a pore space or even a room that you've drilled out. Okay, it will eventually, pretty quickly actually, creep close and seal it completely so that you're back to 1 billion years to move an inch. And that's what you want. Okay, so it doesn't need human help. Okay, it doesn't, it does it all on its own. And we know this because it's been there for 225 million years at least. And it's a great trap for oil and gas, which is why the Permian Basin all across America, the central part of America, is great oil and gas, because way underneath, it's so tight that it will trap the oil and gas. So, but WIP is way above the oil and gas zones. I mean, 8,000 feet above. So 1957, National Academy of Sciences says, okay, salt, you want salt, and you want it in the Permian Basin. And then, of course, the best salt in the Permian Basin is in the Delaware subbasin that goes from southeast New Mexico into West Texas. So about 10,000 square miles of the best salt in the world for this purpose. You only need a few square miles anyway, because we don't have much waste, so we never will. It just doesn't take much material to create a huge amount of energy. So they set aside, 1992, set aside the Land Withdrawal Act that set up WIP. But back in 1957 now, DOE had sorry, AEC eventually became DOE in the 70s, and NRC, and then we started looking for a site like this. Okay, and we actually came to Carlsbad because Carlsbad knows salt. Okay, the miners they know how to mine it, which is very interesting too, because DOE had been run out of town a few places because they first looked for an old salt mine. Now, that might seem smart at the time, but it's not, okay? Because a salt mine is there to make money. It's not there to store waste. So you need to start from scratch and build it exactly the way you want it, not take some old mine that you have no idea what happened.
So what year was that when they first came to Carlsbad then? Was it the late 50s or early 60s?
No, it actually was the middle 70s.
Okay.
Okay, because Carlsbad had heard about this and they invited DOE in. And at that time, the global market for salt had changed because they found a huge deposit of potassium chloride in Canada that suddenly Carlsbad had competition. Because Carlsbad was a closely guarded secret in World War I because we had so much potassium chloride at that point needed for gunpowder. So it was interesting. So Carlsbad has always been a great mining, town, but suddenly they were a little adrift because of the market changes, and they heard about this. Oh, we need salt, and they said, "Well, we know salt." So DOE came in, and the funny thing was that DOE didn't know salt. They don't know mining, and the miners in Carlsbad could actually tell them what they needed for this waste disposal site. Okay, because the miners know how to cut rooms and openings to regulate the speed of closure. So if you want the salt not to close in quickly because you're going to use that space to run trucks up and down, that kind of thing. So if you want something to last 100 years as an opening, you cut it into a circle, right? Or a cylinder, because the stress is evenly distributed around that circle, and it won't creep close very fast. It will eventually close, but it won't close as fast. Now, the drifts that WIP uses to run waste and salt up and down, the horizontal drifts, horizontal tunnels that are called drifts in mine speak.
Right.
When those you want to stay open the length of the project, like 40 or 50 years. So those you cut into squares or square rectangular cylinders. But the rooms where the waste goes in, you want to close as soon as you fill them. You want them to close in 10 years. And those you cut into long rectangles, which are unstable in terms of the closure of the salt. And so those you cut, footfield long, 30 feet wide and 13 feet high, and they will close in 10 years. So, and that's what you want. You want the salt to close. Now, a lot of people said, well, why don't you build structures to keep the salt open? It's like, no, you don't want it to stay open. The whole point of this is to close so tightly that nothing will happen in a billion years. So that's where it stood. And so here's the Carlsbad miners told DOE, we know how to do this, and DOE was like stunned that they'd actually be wanted. so that's fine. Now, back up to the early 70s. The AEC chose salt as the ultimate repository for everything, not just for transuranic or high level or whatever, for everything. Everything was supposed to go on this because it shouldn't matter what the waste is if you want to get rid of it forever and ever. So the rock type should not depend on the waste, right? So you want a rock that'll do everything for everything without any human intervention for a billion years. And that's what the Salado salt is. So then in the early 70s, we had decided, well, we're not going to reprocess spent fuel for the incorrect idea that you can make weapons out of it. You cannot make weapons from recycling commercial fuel.
Because France, let me interject real quick.
Right.
France recycles their fuel.
Right, correct? Right. And they can't make weapons out of that either.
Right.
You make weapons out of a weapons reactor fuel. Okay. And when you put fuel into a reactor, normal light water reactor, after 6 months, you start breeding in neutron poisons that will poison any ability to make a weapon from it. Okay, now that's not usually known, or it's not intuitive, certainly. So after 6 months, it's no good. So if you have to make weapons, you cannot make weapons. We tried, we tried, but even terrorists know you can't make a weapon out of commercial spent fuel. So no one cares about that. We don't care whether Iran has a commercial power reactor. They do. We care about enriching for weapons, or a weapons reactor like we had up here in Hanford. Okay, so because a commercial reactor, the spent fuel is in the reactor for 6 years, it is absolutely worthless to make weapons. However, in the 70s, the politicians, or the bureaucrats, I guess, whatever you want to call them, decided that we were not going to reprocess because of the fear or the perception that you might make weapons out of it. So we got rid of that. And everyone remembers Carter outlawed reprocessing. It wasn't
Right.
quite true. It wasn't quite true, but okay, he stopped reprocessing. Everyone forgets that Reagan undid that. So Reagan made it okay to reprocess again, but we just don't. So the first Department of Energy Secretary, Jim Schlesinger, someone had his ear, okay? And they said, well, we might change our minds. We might want to get that spent fuel back out in the future. So we want a retrievable repository, all right? We want it to be able to stay open, not close, for as long as we want, but at least 50 years. And so, I mean, that's a screen door in a submarine. It is really stupid, okay? The idea that you're going to compromise your permanent billion-year repository because you might want to get the stuff out later. Okay, I hope you can hear my voice dripping with cynicism, because
No,
that
I
was.
do. But is that where the beginning of interim storage came in?
Yes, and Yucca Mountain.
Okay.
Okay, that's where that came from. Okay, so suddenly we're going to have, and at the same time, we split our nuclear waste into 4 categories: spent nuclear fuel, high level waste, which is bomb waste only. People forget that. Spent nuclear fuel has nothing to do with high level waste. It's bomb waste. And then transuranic waste, which is the other type of bomb waste, and then low level waste. Now, the first 3 require deep geologic disposal, okay, by law. That's what the National Academy of Sciences came up with, that the best thing to do is put it in the earth, because the earth is the only thing that has made anything that lasted more than 100,000 years. Humans generally don't. I love the pyramids. Pyramids are great, but we generally don't make things that last that long. So suddenly we have 3 different categories of waste that need deep geologic disposal. And we've decided we want to get the spent fuel, maybe get it out in 50 years. So suddenly salt is out. Okay, the best rock in the world for this purpose is suddenly jettisoned, because we have this idea we want a retrievable repository. So suddenly salt's out for the high level waste and the spent nuclear fuel. But the transuranic waste just kept on going into the salt. And my thoughts is, well, no one even knew what transuranic waste was anyway. Okay, but transuranic waste is waste from making bombs that doesn't have a lot of fission products in it. Now, I don't know if you want a little short primer on nuclear
No,
weapons.
no, I don't actually. But what I want to get at is that, so the salt is good for whip, and
Right.
I understand where you're going with about yucca. But what I want to steer you back towards is the interim storage site that is being proposed in Eddy and Lee County in southeast New Mexico, and why that is a good location and why
Right.
it's safe.
Right. So, but let me just finish up with the Yucca Mountain thing. So because salt was out for high level waste and spent nuclear fuel, now we had to start looking for another site. And DOE said that they would take all the waste and put it in this permanent disposal site in 1998. Well, that of course didn't happen, because they picked Yucca Mountain for purely political reasons. And it's just a terrible rock. And so they picked it for purely political reasons. And you might want to know who was Speaker of the House in 1987 and who was House Majority Leader. That's why it was picked. Very fascinating from that point of view, but it wasn't science based. So then, because they chose a lousy rock. And we worked on it. I worked on that for 25 years, trying to make a lousy rock work. Lots of great science. We didn't waste any money like people think. No, it's great science. We found out everything we need for nuclear waste anywhere. Doesn't matter where you put it. But when Yucca Mountain was, eventually submitted its license application to NRC in 2008, it was obvious it was not going to happen. Because it was politically chosen, no one, beginning in 1987 in Nevada could get elected to any office if they supported Yucca Mountain. So it was doomed to fail. It's a lousy rock anyway, that's fine. So then we passed this 1998 date that DOE is supposed to take everyone's waste and put it in this repository. So now suddenly, oh my God, we don't have a place to put it. And you said you'd take it. So that is like, well, hold on, we'll eventually find the site. We'll eventually pick a site, or we'll, eventually burn this, spend fuel in fast reactors in the future, towards the end of the century. So we need to just put it in dry cache storage. I mean, it's like putting it in stasis. All right. It's like when you move and you put your stuff in a storage facility. So we're just going to hang on to it for a while till we figure out whether we're going to burn it in the near future or where we're going to dispose of it permanently. And that's all dry cache storage is. And the nice thing about spent fuel is that it is easy to do dry cache storage on, because again, like we were mentioning, there's no liquid in it. It's completely solid, really solid. So all you need to do is provide a little bit of shielding as it cools off. So you put it in this dry cache container and it just sits there cooling off. And that's all it does, okay? So you go through a couple of half-lives of strontium and cesium, and then it's quite cool. And then you're gonna decide what you're gonna do with it. Now, backing up to where you put it, yeah, at first, of course, every nuclear reactor has its own storage site because that's where the fuel is. And if you have nowhere to put it yet officially, then you're gonna just hold on to it. So that's why all the sites across the country, even where the nuclear reactor is gone, still has nuclear waste sitting in dry cache storage, which is fine as far as it goes. But again, it's kind of ridiculous to have 100+ places with dry cache storage sitting around, even especially when the reactor is not even there. So then you say, okay, we need a centralized interim storage. Now, this was also recommended by the President Obama's Blue Ribbon Commission,
right?
Which came down there, and I was one of the hosts there. And they said, yeah, of course, dry cache storage. I mean, it was a great commission actually. And they also reiterated the fact that you eventually have to find a place. You have to do what's the term? I can't remember. You need to get buy-off from everyone. Of
Consent.
course you're gonna, yeah, consent. Okay, you need consent. Of course you need consent. How ridiculous not to. But they also brought up the point that, consent is not, consent for New Mexico doesn't mean someone in Alaska has to say. I mean, that's foolish, okay? It has to be conditioned on who's affected. So the people that are most affected should have the biggest voice. And the farther away you get from the site, that you should have less and less voice because you're less and less affected. So that's what the Blue Ribbon Commission decided. And of course, we haven't really done that much. And everyone thinks that their anti-nuclear voice is as important as anyone else's, and that's not quite true. I mean, everyone has a voice, but the people that are most affected should have the biggest voice. I mean, that is the bottom line with anything. It doesn't matter whether you're citing a storage facility or whether you're citing a railroad or whether you're citing any other municipal waste dump.
So let's talk about that real quick here. Is that the Eddie Lee Energy Alliance, which is comprised of Hobbs, Lee County, Eddy County, and Carlsbad, formed this group. It's local elected officials and appointed officials, and they approached. Well, they'd put out an RFP, and Holtec won the RFP. Holtec International won the RFP to do this proposed consolidated interim storage. So there is support in that part of the state, because that part of the state understands, first of all, oil and gas. They understand nuclear. They have waste WIP there. They have the Urenco facility in Lee County in Eunice, New Mexico. So there is that energy IQ, so to speak, that's higher than in maybe other parts of the state, except for probably Los Alamos and Sandia. And so there is consent there. So they have that base. And recently, there was an article that you responded to. There was an article that stated that putting nuclear waste, such as WIP, and as this potential, rather proposed interim storage, is a form of environmental racism. And you wrote an opinion that we're going to post on social media. You wrote a response, rather, that was disingenuous. Can you talk a little bit about that and why
Yes,
that type of argument is, and why the opposition towards this project is disingenuous?
yes, because I mean, environmental justice is a real thing. It's very important. I mean, those that are in power for, for 1,000 years have used environmental injustice in one form or another to oppress certain peoples. And so if you put a toxic waste dump in a poor part of town, or you put a coal plant without any scrubbing in a poor part of town, that is environmental racism, environmental injustice. That's real. It's important. But then to throw something onto nuclear, just because it gets everyone upset or sounds good or something, is wrong. I mean, it's just wrong. And I'm a left-wing, progressive way back. And the idea that you have environmental justice means two things. First of all, you have to have a population that you're injusticing, okay, that you are oppressing. There's no one around WIP. I mean, it's absolutely no one lives around WIP. Okay, Carlsbad and Hobbs are the closest things, and I wouldn't consider those a poor population that's being unjustly hurt or something. And second, you have to have a health effect. You have to have an environmental health effect. There's no effects from nuclear waste. And although everyone thinks it's so horrible, no one has ever been harmed. And I don't mean just killed. I mean, no one's ever been harmed by nuclear waste. Okay, so how could you claim that's environmental racism when there's no one's been harmed and no one is ever going to be harmed? It's too easy to shield nuclear. That's one of the things that's weird, is that it sounds bad. Yeah, and if you hug the fuel bundle without any shielding, it would be pretty bad. But you don't do that. It's too easy to see radiation. It's too easy to shield it, and that's why no one's ever been harmed. And that gets back to the Environmental Monitoring Center I used to be director of, NMSU in Carlsbad. It is the best monitoring facility in the world. I mean, it was so nice to work there. They can see anything. Okay. The thing about radiation that's unlike mercury or lead or some kind of toxic contaminant is that you can see one atom disintegrating. Okay, CMERC can see one atom disintegrating. Now you need 1 billion atoms to even see lead or mercury or dioxin or any other toxic chemical with a mass spec. I mean, you need billions of atoms. You can't see one atom, but you can see one atom disintegrating with respect to nuclear. So you always see radiation, because there's radiation everywhere. I mean, we're bathed in radiation. That wall behind you has a ton of uranium in it. Just kidding. I mean, it has a lot of uranium in it, but it's not going to hurt you, but it's there and you can measure it. It's very easy. It will set off alarms. In fact, one of the, after 9/11, we put a bunch of radiation detectors in DC and they kept alarming because they were next to granite. Okay, so, all right. You can get upset at any radiation, but it takes an awful lot of radiation to hurt anyone. And there's radiation everywhere. So the thing about CMERC as a monitoring center, the thing about dry cask storage and the idea of environmental injustice is that it's too easy to see it, it's too easy to shield against it. So you really can't claim environmental injustice unless someone's being hurt. And so just because you're anti-nuke and you just get all excited and enthusiastic about being anti-nuke, and then you pull in something that has nothing to do with it, yet is very, very important. That's the definition of disingenuous. I mean, all you're doing is diluting the idea of environmental injustice by putting it on something that has nothing to do with it.
So the other point that a lot of the opposition groups have for this consolidated interim storage facility that's proposed for Lee County, it's right, basically right in the middle of equal distance between Hobbs and Carlsbad, and it's inside the Lee County line. Is about the transportation of spent fuel, and that's where they bring in this argument that the transportation by train is also going to be environmental racism.
Yeah.
And tell me, because I know you have expertise in this from the transportation of WIP, for instance, and I know that's truck, but
no, truck. And we have experience with rail transport.
Exactly. That's what I was going to bring up.
And
is you understand that? Please explain to our listeners here on KCC how safe it is.
Right. The transportation casks are what are called 72B casks. And we test those like you wouldn't believe. And we mentioned before we put them on trucks and ride them into brick walls at 80 miles an hour. We put them on trains and run them into brick walls or bunkers at 80 miles an hour. And they just bounce around. You get a crane, you pick them up, you put them back on. They're just indestructible. We've never had a problem transporting spent fuel or weapons or special nuclear material around the country. We have done it for millions and millions of miles over the last 40 years, okay? Things have gone through every place you can think of with nuclear material. There's never been a problem, ever. Now, at the same time, the public doesn't care about chlorine trucks going through town, and those kill people all the time. And the huge one in Georgia, it's like, again, this is all misunderstanding and misdirection as well, because the risks are so small for nuclear anything, and that's reflected in the fact that no one ever dies, no one ever gets harmed, and yet the vision of a mushroom cloud in the head that comes in whenever you mention the word nuclear or radioactive just kind of throws out all rational thought. And if you just did your homework, and I'm sorry, you got to do your homework. I know people hate homework, but you got to do it. You have to find out what kills people, what hurts people, and you realize that it's not nuclear. It's a whole bunch of other things that everyone puts up with and doesn't care about that kill people all the time. But they just get all upset about nuclear because they've been told to. One thing about the Cold War was it was meant to scare everyone about nuclear, and it worked. I mean, it was supposed to scare everyone about nuclear, but it didn't make it didn't distinguish between nuclear power and nuclear weapons, which have nothing to do with each other.
I was just going to bring that up. Is that the fear that many people have is that they equate nuclear energy with nuclear weapons, and it's not even the same thing at all.
Yeah,
correct?
Absolutely nothing. And it was intentional. I hate to say that. I'm sorry, my bad. But nuclear was meant to scare everyone. I mean, the Cold War was meant to scare everyone about nuclear because of weapons. It had nothing to do with power. And so the idea that a gasoline station in town poses much higher risk for human health and the environment than this facility could ever pose. There's just no mechanism, no natural or even unnatural mechanism that could get any amount of radioactive material out of these dry casts and to the public. Okay, I mean, you have, if something happened, you'd have to be standing within 10 feet of it. Okay, this just, that's it. And that's if something happened, and it never does.
And you have to be standing there for a prolonged period of time too.
Yeah,
correct?
yeah, yep, depending on it. I mean, it's not like, the casts are going to suddenly disappear like it's been transported on Star Trek. You can't, I understand science fiction, love it, absolutely love it. Actually, it's what got me into science. But it's just science fiction. Okay, there is realities here. You have to understand transport mechanisms. You have to understand physics. You have to understand chemistry. And when you do, this is just a no, never mind. And I hate to say that because I'm not trivializing it. It's just that's what we have learned in the last 70 years. That's why we build it this way. And dry cask storage is about the safest thing you can do. There is no safer job in America than guarding a dry cask storage facility. None, absolutely none.
Well, also, since you brought that up about the safest jobs in America, this is the most heavily regulated industry in America. I mean, they're just as I know for a fact that the the paperwork and all of the things that Holtec has to do to get an NRC license has it's been time consuming, and it should be because people need to understand that it's safe. But this is a heavy regulated industry, isn't that correct?
Oh yes, it's absolutely absurd actually, and it's why it costs more. And that's okay; it's worth it. I don't have a problem. I love regulations, regulation. It's why America is safer than any other place with respect to this kind of stuff. But it's kind of absurd that no other industry has to be regulated like this at all. But again, it's why the mortality rate for nuclear power is less than 0.1 life per trillion kilowatt hours, and why coal is 10,000 deaths per trillion kilowatt hours. Even wind is 140 deaths per trillion kilowatt hours. So again, what's your measure of bad? Is it death? Is it destruction? Well, by any measure, nuclear is safer than anything else. So again, this is all perception, and it's purposely stoked. And I understand that. Okay, that's fine. But I mean, if you care about the country, then you should care about where we put this waste. I mean, I love it when you talk to people who don't want it anywhere. It's like, well, you got to put it. It's somewhere now. Okay,
Right.
it's at 121 different sites.
Well,
So
for
you'll find
instance,
with that.
one of the sites it's on is the San Onofre nuclear facility, which is called Songs. It's right
Right.
outside San Diego. It is literally on a fault line.
And
So,
yeah,
and it's a decommissioned facility, but there's still dry casts there that
right.
are in search of a home.
Yeah, and the people that are even against the dry casts, it's sort of like, okay, you guys won, you shut down Songs, I get it, but now you want to get the waste out of there, but you don't want to put it anywhere else. I mean, there are some realities here. Okay, if you don't want it one place, you got to put it someplace. And we do this all the time with toxic chemicals, with biological waste, with municipal waste, and those things kill people all the time. And I worked with all of them. The biological waste is nasty stuff. But nuclear waste, piece of cake. I love working with it. Okay, I've worked with it for 35 years. No big deal. My family's lived near it. My grandchildren live near it, work with it. So I don't, there just is no reality to this fear. But if you want to get into why we even have this fear at the beginning, then you have to go back to the 40s.
Right. And I understand concern. People should be concerned. You should ask questions. But then, and you said this earlier, but when your questions are answered, then you shouldn't be starting to ask ridiculous questions
Right,
and
right.
start getting into ridiculous hyperbole. And that's what I've been noticing since I've been working on, a disclaimer, I've been working on a whole tech project since 2018. And, I've seen and I've heard some of the most ridiculous arguments against it, and there have been some valid questions that people ask, and we are happy to answer those questions. That's why we're doing this show right now, Nuclear Waste Matters, because we want people to understand and have their concerns addressed. You mentioned earlier, and in your response to that article, that this site, this is an interim storage site. We don't know where this is not first of all, this is not going to be the permanent repository for this spent fuel. It's not designed for it. That's one of the other arguments that we hear, that this is going to be de facto a permanent facility. It is not designed for a permanent facility. The interim storage facility that Holtec has designed for this location, it only goes down 25 feet. It's completely retrievable. So if in case that there is going to be And at some point, the country is going to have a permanent repository, correct?
Right, right, absolutely. And so you need to pick one, and that's okay. It's not like, this is that difficult because we've been studying this for 70 years and we know it very well. There's no unanswered questions. People think we don't know. It's like there's no unanswered questions here. We can tell you exactly what's going to happen, exactly what it is. And so even with that level of understanding, the level of fear is just greater. So I yeah, so I guess another way to put it is that what's the value of a human life? I mean, what do you value, and how much money are you willing to spend to save a human life? So it's kind of bizarre, but EPA has put a value on a human life according to environmental concerns. So if something in the environment kills you, like toxic material in a river, like flint, lead in the water, what's the value according to EPA? It's $7 million per human life. Okay,
Wow.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. Now, the healthcare profession actually has a better view of that because they're the ones that actually save lives. $316,000 is the average paid out in healthcare over a lifespan. Okay, now some people spend more, some people less, but the average is $316,000. That's what the healthcare industry considers the value of a human life. Now, of course, lawyers are really clever. Their average historical legal value of a human life is $129,000. That's the average paid out in wrongful death suits. Now, if you're a celebrity, you're going to get more. If you're someone that no one knows, not going to get as much. But yeah, $129,000. Now, it's horrible that the death benefit to families of deceased soldiers averages $12,000. I mean, that really tells you where our priorities are. Of course, it can be different in combat situations, but again, $12,000 is the average paid out to deceased soldiers' families. Now, if you are a healthy single male in his 20s, and you're chopped up and your body part sold on the black market, you can get $45 million. That's quite a difference. On the other hand, DOE is paying about $2.5 billion per theoretical life in terms of nuclear waste. Okay, theoretically, we're saving lives, 1,000 years from now by disposing of things in Yucca Mountain or whatever, and even dry cat storage. I mean, we're spending on average $2.5 billion per life saved because it is so difficult to kill anyone with radiation, especially if
That's
you take care of
interesting.
it.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, I mean,
I was wondering where you were going with this.
yeah, that's where
okay.
I go with that. So we don't spend $2 billion to save a single life. So why are we doing that with respect to nuclear waste? I mean, it's just, no, on the other hand, if you took just that $2.5 billion per theoretical life saved in the distant future, and you actually spend it, you could immunize most of Africa against the three biggest scourges at $100 per life. So again, you need to step back. I know, people that are anti-nuclear and all that get all the enthusiastic and everything. You need to step back and get a little perspective here. There's a lot of things that kill you in this life, and we spend a lot of money doing some things, but we never kill anyone with nuclear or nuclear waste. And even though you can dream of it and think of mushroom clouds in the future, that has nothing to do with nuclear power or waste, doesn't mean it's true. And you can spend billions and billions of dollars protecting against something that doesn't exist, or you can spend that money and actually save people's lives now. So again, you need to think about this in more than just a technical way.
This show is Nuclear Waste Matters. I'm Gerges Scott. We're speaking with Dr. Jim Conca. And Jim has a long experience in the Carlsbad area, especially with WIP. Jim, why is it you just laid out, expertly laid out that there's never been a death from nuclear energy and nuclear waste. Why is it
in this country.
in this
Okay.
country?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
Why is it such just an opposition to it? I mean, it's really organized opposition that I constantly run into. There's one thing there's grassroots opposition, these are like kind of like corporations, anti-nuclear
Yeah.
corporations that are
Yep.
organized against, and they put out these talking points and travel around the country. And you hit on it earlier, when we were doing the scoping for the environmental impact statement, there were people as far away as Michigan coming down to southeast New Mexico to voice their opposition to the project.
Right.
Why is that?
It's ideological. And it's straight and simple ideological. It came out of nuclear weapons protests. That's what it came out of. It came out of the Cold War. And it came out of the misunderstanding of the effects of low levels of radiation, which was a purposeful thing in the 1940s and 50s, but was wrong. So when you get ideological like that, and you get people, you get followers. I mean, it is, I don't want to make too weird sounding, but it's a religion. It truly is a religion. And no amount of knowledge or understanding or science will sway most of these people, because they have simply, been thinking this way and been inundated their entire lives, or at least recently, for years, that that this is the way they need to oppose it, because for some reason, America, save America, save life, whatever, you need to oppose this. It's just an ideological thing. And unfortunately, the people that,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
and the people that are leading it either know better, which is sad, or they know nothing about nuclear. They just accept science fiction and whatever's told to them. But yeah,
But it seems like they cherry pick various scientific facts to make their argument instead of looking at the whole scientific picture. Like you said earlier, that Yucca Mountain was a political decision when
right.
they chose that site. There is science based in picking this particular site because of the climate is dry, the geology is stable, and they overlook all of those scientific facts and cherry pick all these different things to make an argument and put a lot of fear out there.
Yeah,
How do,
of
how,
course.
how do we address those people?
Well, I mean, reality does eventually rise up and kick you in the shins if you ignore it. So the idea of climate change, I thought, would really get different conversations going, but they don't even care about that. Even though all the climate scientists say you need nuclear to address climate change, period. I mean, all the, from Jim Hansen on down. So then it just gets to the voting public. It's all about the voting public, because the people that really are ideologically incensed by anything that has nuclear in it, the numbers are not that high. I mean, it's higher than you'd think, but it's not that high. Most people don't know and would like to know. I mean, I give talks about this all over the place all the time, and people want to know. They understand that sound bites don't do it. They don't know. They want to know. Unfortunately, in any ideological issue, science and education, they take a while to talk about, right? I mean, I can give you an awfully great nuclear waste talk, but it's going to take an hour. There's no soundbite.
Well, I'm going to tell you what. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to do this again because
Oh, good.
there's just so much that we can talk about. But I want to throw out some things here real quick, just to get people to understand about where the Holtec project is right now. Today is October. In October, in November, sometime in November, the NRC is going to release the final EIS, the Environmental Impact Statement. In December, we believe the safety report will come out, and then the license from the NRC for this particular facility in southeast New Mexico is expected in late January or early February. And that's the timeline. So in between now from today, where we're talking, we're going to have a couple more opportunities to talk about not just this project, but nuclear energy, nuclear waste as moving forward, because we want people to be comfortable and have their concerns addressed. So, Jim, some final thoughts about nuclear waste and why people, and let me throw this fact out there too. If you took all the nuclear waste that is currently being stored in our country today and put it in one place, it would be, and so people can understand it in ways that they understand, especially in Southeast New Mexico, about the size of a football field.
Right.
Okay.
But
So
I like to use a high school soccer field. That's it. Okay?
Well, we're in football country in Carlsbad, and so it's about the size of a football field.
Yeah, that's it.
But there is still just so much concern. So give me some final thoughts, and we're going to wrap this up today on Nuclear Waste Matters. But I promise we'll be back again shortly.
Every other waste stream in America kills people, has killed people. Lots of data on that. OSHA has all that sorts of data on that. Nuclear is the only one that has not. And nuclear's waste stream is about 1 million times less than that of like coal. Okay, it's 1 million times less than almost everything else. We treat 2 quadrillion gallons of wastewater every year from municipal facilities. I mean, that's real waste. One soccer field full of waste in history is really trivial, and the waste is easy to contain, easy to shield. Again, it's sort of like, for those of us who know it so well, it's like, what is the problem here? And the problem is just perception. That's
there you
all.
go. And we're going to leave it at that. So, Jim, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to be back again shortly. You are listening to Nuclear Waste Matters. I'm Gerges Scott. You've been listening to Dr. Jim Conca, and for all his friends in Carlsbad, I know you know who he is. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
You bet. And we will see you soon. Thank you, everyone.